It all started the night I moved into the new house. The place was secluded, tucked between thick woods with an eerie silence that seemed to weigh on the air. I'd been looking forward to some quiet, a chance to escape the endless noise of the city and reset. But I'd barely stepped foot inside when the silence took on a darker tone. From the first moment, it felt like the house was watching. Not in that vague, creaky old house way, but like something was scrutinizing every single move I made. The walls seemed to breathe in unison with me, and shadows slithered and bent in unnatural ways as the dim evening light seeped in through the dusty windows. My mind clung to rational explanations, tricks of the light, leftover anxiety from the move. But no amount of logic stopped the feeling from settling into my bones like an icy chill. As night fell, I decided to unpack just the essentials. Some clothes, my phone, a few lamps, and leave the rest for the morning. The old chandelier above the dining table flickered when I switched it on, casting weak, sputtering light that barely reached the corners of the room. But it was enough to see by, or so I thought, until I noticed the basement door. I hadn't opened it. I wasn't even sure where it led, but there it was, wide open, a gaping maw leading down into blackness. I shivered, staring at it, and after a moment, I could have sworn I heard something shift from below. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I backed away, determined to ignore it. A basement in an old house was bound to have strange noises, right? It was probably just the furnace kicking on or settling of the foundation. But as I moved down the hall to my bedroom, a soft scraping sound started to echo from the basement. I froze, my skin prickling. That wasn't the kind of noise old houses made. It was closer, almost deliberate, like someone dragging their nails along the floor, scratching and scraping in a slow, rhythmical pattern. For a split second, I wondered if someone had somehow gotten into the house. But I'd locked everything, hadn't I? Trying to stay calm, I convinced myself that it was just paranoia. Maybe the pipes were old and clanking, or there was a mouse in the basement. But just as I started to walk away, the scraping stopped. Dead silence filled the house, so thick it felt suffocating. Then, a soft whisper drifted up the stairs. It wasn't the pipes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I leaned closer to the doorframe, just enough to make out faint sounds coming from below. Words barely intelligible, muffled as if spoken through clenched teeth. "Come down. Come see." My pulse raced, my throat tightening. Every rational bone in my body told me to leave, but curiosity, dark and inexplicable, rooted me in place. After all, I had just moved in. This was my home now. I took a step forward, hesitating at the top of the stairs. The basement was pitch black. Even as I flicked on the light switch, the bulb barely illuminated anything beyond the first few steps. Taking a deep breath, I descended into the dark, one hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. Halfway down, the air grew colder, thick with an earthy, metallic scent that made my stomach twist. At the bottom, I strained my eyes, searching for the source of the sound. The walls were lined with old shelves, stacked with dusty, forgotten objects. And in the middle of the room, something sat, cloaked in shadows. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a mirror. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but the longer I looked, the more it seemed to call to me, to tug at something deep within. I took a few shaky steps forward, curiosity overpowering the unease creeping up my spine. When I was close enough, I reached out, brushing my fingers against the edge. And then, I saw it. Not my reflection, but something else, something behind me in the mirror. A face, pale and stretched, staring with hollow eyes that bore into mine. My own reflection was gone, replaced by this gaunt, haunted figure that mirrored my every move. I felt paralyzed, every fiber of my being screaming to look away, to run. But I couldn't move. The figure leaned closer, its mouth twisting into a slow, predatory smile. "Welcome home," it whispered, its voice scratching like nails on a chalkboard, echoing in my mind. My throat was dry, my voice trapped, but somehow I forced myself to move. I stumbled backward, breaking free from the trance, and dashed up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I spent the night huddled in my bedroom, clutching my phone, but there was no signal. The silence returned, oppressive and heavy, like a weight pressing down on me. But in the darkness, I could hear faint laughter, soft and sinister, drifting up from below. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, that face lurked in the darkness, waiting, watching. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light filtered through the blinds, I grabbed my car keys and bolted out of the house. My heart was still racing from the night before, and the image of that face, its hollow eyes, that twisted grin, was burned into my mind. I convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined it, that stress and exhaustion had played tricks on me. But some part of me knew better. The house was wrong, and that mirror, it was something else entirely. I spent the entire day in town, finding excuses to stay away. Every time I thought about going back, I'd feel this tight knot of dread in my stomach. But around noon, I realized I'd left my phone charger and wallet behind. So unless I planned to sleep in my car, I'd have to return. I pulled up to the house around dusk, trying to calm my nerves. From the outside, everything looked normal. The house was quiet, still. Too still, I noticed, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. I tried to shake off the feeling as I unlocked the door, stepping inside slowly, ears straining for any hint of that sinister laughter from the night before. Nothing. Just the soft hum of silence and the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. After gathering my things, I told myself I'd just sleep here one more night. Then, if the feeling didn't go away, I'd start looking for somewhere else. But as I moved through the house, checking each room, something felt off. Took me a while to realize what it was. The basement door. It was open again. I stopped dead in my tracks, my pulse pounding. I was positive I'd shut it last night. Not just shut it, I'd slammed it, locked it, and now here it was wide open, revealing that dark staircase descending into the shadows below. This time, I felt something else coming from that doorway. A strange pull, an almost magnetic draw, tugging me forward despite every instinct screaming to stay away. It was like the air itself was charged, buzzing faintly, almost alive. I took a step forward, then another, unable to stop myself. My feet moved of their own accord, leading me down into the darkness. As I descended, the air grew colder, damp, and heavy with that same metallic scent from before. And there it was again, the mirror, standing in the center of the basement, reflecting the faint light trickling down the stairs. But now something was different. A figure stood in front of the mirror, a hazy silhouette with its back turned, head slightly tilted as though it were staring into the glass. I froze on the last step, watching as it slowly, almost painfully, began to turn toward me. It wasn't my reflection. The figure had my outline, my hair, my clothes, but its skin was sallow, with deep shadows around its hollow eyes, and its mouth was twisted in a mocking, unnatural smile. And then, as if it had been watching my thoughts, the figure raised a hand and waved. I felt a scream building in my throat, but no sound came out. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on me, choking off any sound. The figure in the mirror cocked its head, watching me with a kind of cruel amusement. Then it spoke. "You don't belong here," it hissed, the voice echoing in the small space, a chorus of raspy whispers. "This is my house now." With a sudden, sickening lurch, the mirror tilted, its surface rippling like water. I watched in horror as the figure's hand pressed against the glass from the inside, pushing outward, distorting as if trying to break through. Panic overtook me. I scrambled back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut once more. My breaths were coming in short, panicked gasps, and I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming to run. But then, I heard it, the soft creak of footsteps on the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. The door handle began to turn, and I rushed to hold it closed, pressing my weight against it. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a whisper, low and venomous. "You can't keep me out forever." My hands shook as I held the door shut, my heart pounding against my chest. Then, after a moment, everything went quiet. The air felt lighter, as if the presence had lifted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just behind the door, waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the living room, every light in the house on, clutching a flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. I tried calling someone, anyone, but the signal was still dead. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. As dawn broke, I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get out of this house. As the first light of dawn stretched across the living room, relief washed over me, but it was thin and fleeting. I didn't bother to change or gather anything else. I just grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and made a beeline for the door. The air outside was crisp, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again, free from the oppressive darkness of that place. But as I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. The front door of the house was wide open. My stomach dropped. I could have sworn I'd closed it behind me. And there, in the shadowy doorway, I thought I saw a figure. Just a glimpse too quick to catch clearly, but enough to make my skin crawl. I started the car, hands trembling as I put it in gear and tore down the driveway, not daring to look back again until I was a good mile down the road. Only then did I allow myself a glance in the rearview. The house was nowhere in sight, hidden by the trees and the winding road. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that I was safe. I drove to a small motel in town, where I rented a room and spent most of the day in bed, trying to shake off the night's terror. I kept telling myself that the nightmare was behind me, that I could leave the house and never look back. But when night fell, I felt the fear creeping back, prickling at the edges of my mind. The house haunted my thoughts, its dark rooms and whispering shadows drawing me in, even from miles away. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, an unsettling compulsion had taken hold. Despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I found myself back in the car, driving toward the house as if something were pulling me there, guiding my every turn. I told myself it was just to gather my things, to make a clean break. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. When I arrived, the house looked different. The air around it was thick, almost vibrating with tension. The windows stared out at me like empty, hungry eyes. I hesitated at the edge of the driveway, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. But the pull was irresistible, like a hand gripping the back of my neck, guiding me forward. I stepped out of the car and slowly walked up the driveway, feeling the weight of that invisible grip tighten with every step. When I reached the porch, I found the door slightly ajar, just enough to invite me inside. I swallowed hard, steeling myself, and pushed it open. The house was silent. The air inside was stale, thick with that metallic scent that had lingered in the basement. As I moved through the hall, the silence grew heavier, pressing down on me, until I felt like I could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. It was as if I was moving in a dream, drawn by an unseen force toward the basement door. Stood wide open, waiting. I took a shaky breath, then slowly descended the stairs. The basement was darker than before, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift as I stepped down, deeper into the murky air. And there it was, standing in the middle of the room. The mirror. The surface was no longer just a reflection. It rippled, a dark, inky void swirling beneath the glass. And there, standing inside the mirror, was the figure again. Its form hazy and distorted, but unmistakably watching me with those hollow, sunken eyes. "I told you," it whispered, the words dripping with malice. "You belong to me now." I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure raised a hand, pressing it against the glass from the inside, and I watched in horror as its hand began to push through. The glass rippled, stretching around its fingers, distorting as if it were made of thick liquid. Slowly, painfully, the figure began to emerge. I stumbled back, breaking free from whatever invisible force held me in place. As I turned to flee up the stairs, I felt a cold, skeletal hand wrap around my wrist, gripping me with impossible strength. I looked back and saw it. Halfway through the mirror now, its face twisted in a malicious grin, eyes empty and lifeless, pulling me closer. In a frenzy, I thrashed, kicking and clawing, desperate to break free. My hand landed on something hard and cold on a nearby shelf, a rusted, heavy metal rod. I swung it with all my strength, striking the figure's arm. It let out a hiss, recoiling slightly, and I took the opportunity to wrench myself free, stumbling up the stairs. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. But even as I ran, I could feel it, something creeping closer, the air thickening with its presence, pressing in on me from all sides. I sprinted through the house, slamming doors behind me, but each time, I'd feel that cold whisper at my back, taunting me, closing in. By the time I reached the front door, it was too late. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tried again, yanking at the knob with all my strength, but the door held fast, as if the house itself was holding me hostage. Then, from behind me, a voice whispered, so close it brushed against my ear. "Stay." I turned slowly, heart pounding, to see the figure standing at the end of the hall, watching me with those dead, hollow eyes. Its smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, until its mouth gaped open, black as the void itself. The shadows around it began to twist and pulse, stretching out toward me, creeping along the walls and floor, engulfing everything in darkness. The house was alive. It was breathing, pulsing with each beat of my terrified heart, its walls closing in around me. And I understood then that this wasn't a house. It was something else entirely. A trap, a prison, and I was caught inside it. With one last burst of desperation, I threw myself at the door, slamming my shoulder against it until, finally, it gave way. I tumbled out onto the porch, gasping, scrambling to my feet as I fled down the driveway, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, too far for the shadows of that place to reach me. Even now, I can still feel its presence, lingering just at the edge of my mind, like a shadow that stretches further than it should. It's as if it's waiting, watching, just biding its time until I slip up, until I'm alone again. And every night, as I lie awake, I hear it, the soft, sinister whisper, drifting through the darkness. Come back home. After that escape, I swore I'd never return. I rented a cramped studio in the city and poured every dollar I had into it just to keep myself out of that place. I avoided even thinking about it, burying the memories under layers of distraction. Work, endless nights out, whatever it took to keep the darkness at bay. But some things don't stay buried, and some places don't let go. 3 months went by, and I started to believe it was truly over. The whispers faded, and I began sleeping through the night again. Then, one morning, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was plain, unstamped, with no return address. Just my name on the front in scratchy handwriting that made my skin crawl. I ripped it open and unfolded a single sheet of paper, stiff and old, smelling faintly of mildew. One word was scrawled across it in a sharp, jagged script. Remember. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me, my heart hammering. My mind flashed back to that basement, to the figure pressing against the mirror, its twisted smile, its hollow eyes. I could almost feel that icy hand gripping my wrist again, tugging me back into the darkness. I tried to shake it off as a prank, maybe some bitter neighbor, maybe just my imagination getting the better of me. But 2 days later, the power went out. I was working late, tapping away on my laptop when every light in the apartment flickered and died. I sat in pitch-black silence, the hum of the city outside muffled as if I'd been plunged underwater. I grabbed my phone for light and started to reach for the breaker panel when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The hallway mirror, barely visible in the dim light, was shimmering. At first, I thought it was my tired eyes playing tricks, but as I stared, I saw it. The reflection wasn't right. It was my hallway, my apartment, but the walls seemed to pulse, the shadows deepened, and there, standing in the background, was a figure. It was distant, hazy, almost a blur, but I knew what I was seeing, and a creeping horror snaked up my spine. The figure from the old house. It had followed me, I backed away from the mirror, clutching my phone, watching as the figure's form twisted and shuddered, inching closer. Its eyes were hollow, empty black pits that seemed to pull me in, dragging me toward it even as I tried to look away. And then, without thinking, I shattered the mirror. I smashed it to pieces with the nearest heavy object I could find, shards flying, splintering into glittering fragments on the floor. My breathing was ragged, my heart racing, but as the last piece fell, silence returned. The figure was gone, but the relief was short-lived. In the days that followed, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The shadows around my apartment grew darker, thicker, as if they were waiting for something. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, little more than a rustling just at the edge of my hearing. But as the nights wore on, they grew louder, echoing through the silence of my apartment. Come back home. Every night I heard it. Every night, the voice grew clearer, calling to me, pulling at some dark part of my mind. The figure appeared in other mirrors now, at work, in shop windows, anywhere I caught a glimpse of my own reflection. It was as if the house had imprinted itself on me, an unbreakable tether pulling me back. I became obsessed with finding a way to break the connection. I scoured libraries, searching for anything that might explain what was happening to me. I researched hauntings, cursed objects, anything I thought might offer a clue. But all I found were vague, cryptic warnings about places that trap souls, that feed on fear and hold on to those who try to leave. And then, one night, the whispers changed. You left something behind, it hissed, and for the first time I understood. There was something of mine still in that house, something that tethered me to it. I racked my brain, trying to remember what I'd left behind, but nothing came to mind. I knew then that there was only one way to find out, one way to break free. I had to go back. With dread in my heart, I packed a small bag and drove back to that secluded road. The house loomed at the end of the drive, a black silhouette against the night sky, its windows dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets watching me approach. The air was thick, colder than it had any right to be, and as I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. The front door creaked open as I touched it, as if it had been waiting for me. I stepped inside, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. The air smelled of mildew and dust, but beneath it, that same metallic tang lingered, familiar and nauseating. The house seemed to breathe around me, its walls pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm, like a heartbeat. The basement door stood open, dark and gaping. I took a deep breath, gripping my flashlight, and stepped down into the abyss. As I descended, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me, pressing in from every side. The air was thick with malice, with a presence that felt both ancient and hungry. When I reached the bottom, I saw it, the mirror, untouched, standing in the center of the room. And there, on the floor in front of it, lay something I recognized immediately. My old phone. I didn't remember leaving it. I could have sworn I'd taken it with me when I left. But there it was, and as I stared at it, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling my head until I could barely think. My hands shook as I reached down, picking up the phone. The moment my fingers touched it, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, and there it was, the figure standing inches away, its hollow eyes boring into mine, its mouth stretched into that horrible grin, its voice echoing through my mind, soft and venomous. "You're home." The shadows around me twisted, closing in, swallowing the light. The figure leaned in, its hand icy and solid on my shoulder, pulling me closer to the mirror. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel it pulling me, dragging me toward the glass, toward the dark void that writhed beneath its surface. My reflection disappeared as I was drawn in, replaced by the figure's hollow, dead gaze. The shadows wrapped around me, cold and smothering, and I felt myself slipping, losing hold of reality, sinking deeper into the darkness. And then, just as the last sliver of light faded, I felt the mirror shatter. I woke up outside, sprawled in the dirt at the edge of the driveway, the house looming over me, silent and still. My hands were bleeding, my clothes torn, but I was alive. I staggered to my feet, glancing back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, empty, but for a brief moment, I saw it. My own face, watching me from inside, hollow-eyed and smiling. I left and never looked back. But sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I see something, just a flash, a shadow in the background, watching, waiting. I know it's still there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the day I slip up, for the moment I'm alone again. And when that day comes, I'll hear it. Welcome home. After that final escape, life never really went back to normal. You can't just walk away from something like that, like it's just some bad dream. No matter where I went, that feeling lingered, a sense of something unfinished, lurking just beneath the surface of reality. I tried to settle back into my routine, but it was impossible. Every shadow seemed darker. Every corner of my home seemed watched. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never truly alone. Months passed. I kept busy, filling my days and nights with work, outings, even staying at friends' places when I couldn't stand being alone. Still, there was always that familiar pull in the background, a whisper that never stopped. Come back, come back, come back. One night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to an all-too-familiar feeling of suffocating dread. My room was silent, but something felt off, wrong in a way I couldn't place. I forced myself to sit up, blinking at the shadows in the dim light. And then I saw it. In the mirror across the room, a faint outline. I thought I was still half dreaming, some trick of the dim lighting. But as I stared, the figure solidified, growing sharper until it was unmistakable. The hollow eyes, the twisted grin. It was back, watching me from the other side of the glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place. I wanted to scream, to look away, but I couldn't tear my gaze from the reflection. Slowly, the figure raised its hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass, its fingers spreading wide, skeletal and pale. My heart pounded, my mind racing. I knew what was coming. It wanted me, needed me back in that house. The mirror trembled, rippling like water, and for a moment I could see beyond it. A dark, twisting hallway, a sense of void stretching infinitely in all directions. In the silence, I heard its voice again, as clear as if it were right beside me. You never left. You're still mine. That night, I slept in my car, parked in the city miles from my apartment. But the figure followed me, appearing in every reflective surface, haunting me in shop windows, even in the sheen of dark puddles. It was always there, watching, waiting, a constant reminder that it would never let go. One evening, I was sitting at a diner, trying to distract myself over a late-night coffee. The place was quiet, mostly empty, just me and a few other patrons scattered throughout. I was stirring my coffee absently when a reflection caught my eye in the polished surface of the window beside me. There, as always, was the figure. This time closer, pressing its face to the glass, those dead, hollow eyes staring into mine with a sick, mocking smile. And that's when I noticed something new. In its reflection, I could see the faintest outline of something clasped in its hand. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but as I leaned closer, I realized it was holding a key. My house key, the one I'd thrown out months ago after my last encounter. I knew, without a doubt, it had picked it up from the place I'd left it, the doorstep of that cursed house. I don't know why, but in that moment, anger burned through my fear. I was exhausted, fed up with being chased, haunted, constantly on edge. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to end it once and for all. So I did the only thing that made sense in my mind. I went back. Back to that place I swore I'd never return to. This time, though, I had a plan. I stopped by a hardware store before I went, grabbing a hammer, a bag of salt, some candles, and a lighter. I'd read about these things in my months of desperate research, late-night internet searches that had filled me with half-baked ideas on how to break ties with haunted places. At this point, I was willing to try anything. When I pulled up to the house, it was well past midnight. Fog had rolled in, thick and heavy, clinging to the ground in wisps that seemed to curl around the house like ghostly fingers. The windows were dark, and the whole place exuded a sense of waiting expectancy, as if it knew I'd come. I stepped out of the car, hammer in one hand, salt and candles clutched in the other. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to step forward. The door was unlocked, of course, and as I pushed it open, a wave of freezing air washed over me. The house was silent, every creak of the floorboards echoing through the empty rooms as I moved to the basement door. It was waiting for me, wide open, the staircase descending into darkness. Taking a shaky breath, I lit the candles and started down, the warm glow casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The mirror was still there, standing in the center of the room like a sentinel, its surface rippling with dark energy. I approached it slowly, feeling the temperature drop with every step. As I stood before it, the figure appeared again, clearer than ever, grinning that horrible grin. "I'm here to end this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The figure's smile widened, and I saw its reflection shift, reaching out a hand that seemed to press against the glass from the inside, forming a spiderweb of cracks. But before it could step through, I poured a line of salt around the mirror, forming a tight circle. The figure's hand froze, and I saw its expression shift, that mocking smile turning into something like anger. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. And then, the mirror began to shake violently, the surface warping, distorting as the figure's face twisted in fury. Shadows pulsed around me, swirling faster and faster, but I held my ground, refusing to break eye contact. I raised the hammer, gripping it tightly. This is my last goodbye. With one final swing, I brought the hammer down onto the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying outward, cutting through the air with an almost ear-splitting screech. The moment the mirror broke, the entire house seemed to shake, the walls groaning as if some deep, ancient thing had been wounded. The shadows pulsed one last time, swirling faster before suddenly collapsing, sucked back into the mirror's fractured remains. And then silence. Absolute, deafening silence. I stood there, breathing heavily, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing. The house felt empty, hollow, as if whatever had haunted it had finally been driven out. Slowly, I backed away, leaving the shattered mirror behind. I climbed the stairs, feeling lighter with each step. When I reached the front door, I took one last look back. The house was dark and silent, and for the first time it looked ordinary. I drove away without looking back, half expecting to see that familiar figure in my rearview mirror. But the road remained empty, the night silent, and now, months later, I can finally say it's over. I don't see reflections in mirrors anymore, don't hear the whispers in the night. I'm free, truly free. But sometimes, when the night is especially quiet, I still think I can feel it. The faintest, lingering chill, a reminder of that place and the shadow I left behind. Because I know, deep down, that places like that don't really disappear. They just wait, and one day they might find someone new. It's been a year since that night. Life has returned to a strange version of normal, but the memories of that house, that presence, and those hollow eyes have never completely left me. At times, it feels as though a shadow is lurking in the corners of my vision, just out of reach, reminding me of a debt unsettled. Even though I've tried to convince myself that it's over, that the curse or whatever held me is gone, there's a part of me that's never truly relaxed. Every reflection, a car window, a darkened screen, a stray glance in a shop window, still makes my heart skip a beat. I've learned not to linger, not to look too closely, afraid of what might look back. Then, one quiet night, it happened again. I was heading home late, after spending the evening at a friend's place trying to laugh off some of the darker memories. The streets were empty, bathed in that eerie glow of half-lit streetlights that made everything feel slightly surreal. My building loomed in the distance, silhouetted against a low-hanging moon, and I felt a faint relief as I turned into the alley leading to the back entrance. But that relief was short-lived. Halfway down the alley, I froze, every nerve in my body prickling with a sensation I hadn't felt in months. Ahead of me, about 10 feet away, was a faint, shadowy figure standing completely still. I couldn't make out any features, but there was something chillingly familiar in its posture, in the stillness of it as it waited. I took a shaky step backward, and the figure moved, just a slight tilt of its head, as if it were studying me. My blood turned to ice. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn back, but my feet felt glued to the spot. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the light. But as I took another step back, I saw it. Those hollow, lifeless eyes glinting in the dim light, the faint outline of that same twisted grin. It had found me again. Without thinking, I turned and bolted down the alley, my heart hammering as I sprinted back toward the street. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, heavy and relentless, keeping pace no matter how fast I ran. Panic surged through me, and I cut around the corner, weaving through the streets, desperate to lose it. When I finally reached my building, I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder to see nothing there. The alley was empty, but the sensation of being watched lingered, pressing down on me like a weight. I darted inside, locking the door behind me, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, the silence of my apartment felt safe, almost comforting. But as I moved through the darkened room, switching on lights, I realized I'd been wrong. The mirror in my hallway, the same one where I'd first seen that figure, was shimmering faintly, the glass rippling as though something were just beneath the surface. My blood ran cold, and I backed away slowly, unable to tear my gaze from the mirror. Then it emerged, a pale hand pressed against the glass from the inside, followed by that familiar, hollow-eyed face, grinning with a sick satisfaction. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the room grow colder, the air thickening with a dark, choking presence that wrapped around me like a shroud. I could hear it whispering, faint and distant, a chorus of voices overlapping in a low, echoing hum. "You thought it was over," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "But you never left." I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp in my frantic escape. The mirror began to crack, spiderwebbing outward, as if it were straining to hold the figure back. But I could see its hand pressing harder, pushing through, the glass bending and warping as if it were made of liquid. Desperate, I grabbed the bag of salt I'd kept in my closet, a leftover remnant of my last attempt to break the connection. I poured a circle around myself, my hands shaking, chanting every protection mantra I'd read in those countless sleepless nights of research. The figure's grin twisted into something darker, more furious, as it stared down at the salt barrier. For a moment I thought it was working. The figure seemed to hesitate, its hand recoiling slightly, as if repelled by the line of salt. I felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of escape. But then, its hollow eyes narrowed, and with a soft, mocking laugh, it leaned closer, pressing its face against the cracked glass. I saw its mouth open, and from the darkness within, a single whisper echoed, low and taunting. "Salt can't save you." With a force that shook the entire apartment, the mirror shattered, shards flying in all directions as the figure lunged forward, crossing the threshold between reflection and reality. Its hand, icy and skeletal, reached out for me, fingers stretching as though to wrap around my throat. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the rug, and fell to the floor. I scrambled back, my mind racing, searching for anything that could stop it. My eyes landed on my phone, lying on the floor just a few feet away. With a desperate lunge, I grabbed it and did the only thing that came to mind. I took a picture. For a brief second, the flash illuminated the room, casting harsh light on the figure. And in that instant, it recoiled, letting out a bone-chilling shriek that echoed through the apartment. The figure wavered, its form flickering like a dying flame. And then, just as quickly as it had emerged, it faded, dissolving into a wisp of shadow that disappeared into the cracks of the shattered mirror. I sat there, breathing hard, my hands trembling as I stared at the empty space where it had been. The silence settled again, thick and oppressive, but this time, it felt different, emptier, as though something vital had been drained from the room. For hours, I didn't move, didn't dare to look away from the broken mirror. Finally, as dawn broke, I forced myself to stand, to clean up the shards, to erase any trace of that nightmare from my home. Days passed, and though the fear lingered, the whispers were gone. The reflections no longer held that ominous, watching presence. It was as if, in that final moment, something had shifted, something had changed. The grip it had on me had finally been severed. Now I keep my mirrors covered, refuse to look too closely at my reflection. I've learned to trust the quiet, to savor the ordinary peace of a life free from haunting shadows. But every once in a while, when the night is still, I hear that faint, echoing whisper. Salt can't save you. It's been another few weeks, and while life has mostly returned to something like normal, that last encounter left scars deeper than I'd care to admit. I told myself I'd seen the last of that figure, but part of me remained on high alert, always glancing over my shoulder, bracing for its return. One night, after hours of struggling to sleep, I finally drifted off only to plunge into a vivid, suffocating dream. I was back in that cursed house, standing in the basement, facing that shattered mirror. The room was cold, filled with a dense, almost tangible darkness that seemed to pulse, breathing in unison with my own quickening heart. And there, among the broken shards, I saw it again, that familiar twisted grin and those hollow, sunken eyes watching me, waiting. But this time, the figure wasn't alone. Around it, shadows writhed, contorting into vague human shapes, as if they were made of pure darkness. Their eyes opened, each pair empty and black, hollow pits that seemed to absorb every trace of light. They were whispering, a cacophony of voices overlapping, hissing secrets in a language I couldn't understand. But their intent was clear. They wanted me back. I tried to move, to step away, but my feet wouldn't budge. My reflection in the shards began to warp, twisting and distorting until it no longer looked like me. Instead, it looked like the hollow-eyed figure that had haunted me for so long. It grinned, reaching out from every shard, hundreds of hands stretching toward me, closing in. And then, in unison, the figures whispered, "You never left." I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my chest as if it were trying to escape. The room was dark, silent, but the memory of those whispers lingered, echoing in my mind. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just a nightmare. But as I sat up, catching my breath, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My bedroom mirror was cracked. Not just cracked, but shattered, spiderwebs of broken glass fanning out from the center, as if something had hit it with tremendous force. I stared at it, frozen, watching the darkness shift in the broken reflections. I could see myself, but just behind my reflection, faint and almost invisible in the dim light, was a shadow, figure watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The rational part of me wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Desperate, I called a friend, one of the few who knew about my ordeal. When she heard the panic in my voice, she came right over, and together, we threw every mirror in the apartment into trash bags, carrying them out to the dumpster in the dead of night. We smashed them to pieces, making sure no shard, no fragment was left intact. It was messy, frantic, but as I watched each mirror break into dust, I felt a small sense of control return. But that sense of relief was fleeting. A few days later, strange things began to happen. Objects would move on their own. A glass left on the counter would be on the other side of the room when I turned around. My keys vanished and reappeared in impossible places. My phone once went missing for hours only to turn up in a drawer I hadn't opened in days. I told myself it was just stress, that I was distracted, but deep down, I knew the truth. It was still with me. It didn't need mirrors to haunt me anymore. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, the lights flickered. A familiar chill swept over me, making the air feel thick, heavy. The shadows seemed to deepen, gathering in the corners, and I felt that suffocating presence press down on me again. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper. "I don't need mirrors. The air in the room grew colder, and the walls themselves seemed to close in, the space becoming stifling, oppressive. The shadows in the room started to move, swirling around me, almost playful, taunting. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my breathing, to tell myself it wasn't real. But then the whispers started again, louder this time, filling the air with that familiar, sinister cadence. You can't run. You can't hide. You belong to us now. I backed into a corner, pressing myself against the wall, clutching my phone in my hand like a lifeline. My friend's number was the first on my speed dial, but when I pressed it, the phone glitched, the screen flickering with static.